Hello, everyone. I hope this is working okay. I think it's slightly better doing it by Zoom, but it's always a bit confusing when it starts. Sat there for ages staring at the screen, wondering what's going on. So I hope this is working okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday night live. So there's been quite a few members in the group recently, and I thought rather than just keep fielding questions, which is fine, but I suppose we cover the same stuff over and over again. I thought it might be useful for people who haven't read the book to go to do a sort of a bit more of a back to basics thing. And I thought also there was an issue I wanted to address anyway that came up in one of the other lives. And it's a kind of a general point I wanted to talk about anyway, which is these sort of underlying problems that cause us to drink. And there's quite a wide body of opinion that puts addiction, any kind of addiction, down to some kind of internal hurt or some basic flaw in our character or something wrong with us, and you need to deal with this underlying issue before you have any hope of giving up whatever the substance you're addicted to is. I mean, obviously for the purposes of this we're talking about alcohol. So I thought it would be very useful just to run through, because hopefully it will be a bit of the basics for new members, but also to develop a few points for people who are familiar with the books. So when we're talking, so there's a few things I'm going to discuss here. When we're talking about underlying issues and whether we need to address them before we can have any hope of stopping drinking or whatever drugs we're taking, we firstly have to understand how the drug works on a sort of a physiological level. So that's going to be the starting point. And then I'm going to talk about, I suppose, three separate categories of underlying issues. One are going to be the sort of the smaller scale day-to-day things. One's going to be the more important, the bigger things. And the other thing I'm going to touch on is actual mental health issues, whatever they might be. So talking about the physiological side of things, so alcohol is a chemical depressant, which means it's something that depresses or inhibits nerve activity. Okay, it's a sedative, which is why when we drink, we tend to feel more relaxed. And if you're afraid or something and you have a drink, it anesthetizes those feelings of fear. Okay, that's a fairly basic point. But the thing is, the human brain works by way of homeostasis. Homeostasis essentially refers to a kind of a delicate chemical balance, and that's how your brain works. It creates its own drugs and hormones and chemicals, and it tries to keep a sort of a balance of those. Now, the problem is when you drink alcohol, which is a sedative, your brain tries to counter the sedating effects of the alcohol. It does this in a lot of very different and very complicated ways. But for the purposes of this, and frankly, how I understand it, is it just becomes hypersensitive. It becomes increasingly sensitive, so it can work under the sedating effects of the alcohol. And then when the alcohol wears off, you're left feeling oversensitized. And it leads to sort of anxiety, which is the colloquial term hangxiety. It's that feeling of kind of anxiousness and feeling out of sorts and not quite as resilient as you would otherwise be after drinking. And that's what it is. It's an actual chemical imbalance caused by the previous drinking. What I have done, if I can get it to work, I've done a very, very simple graph, which I will see if it, right, hopefully this is working. So what you can see here, forget the numbers at the side, they're just purely illustrative. But what I want you to imagine is it's easiest, I think, if we divide all these drugs and hormones that our brain has into two basic categories: stimulants and depressants. Depressants I've already talked about. They're things that depress and inhibit nerve activity and make us feel more relaxed and calmer. And stimulants like adrenaline tend to wake us up, they increase our heart rate, we become more alert. Now, imagine this is your brain naturally. So there's a nice equal balance between stimulants and depressants. Now, what happens is when you drink alcohol, you push the depressant side up massively. So what your brain does, it senses that there's been a disturbance to the force, if you like, And it seeks to counter it. And as I say, it's a very complicated process, but essentially the brain becomes oversensitive so it can still function under the depressive effects of the alcohol, the sedating effects of the alcohol. So what your brain does is essentially this. Okay, so that's all well and good. But then after 5 or 6 hours, the alcohol starts to wear off, and this happens. Now, this is the overstimulation phase. This is the phase I talk about, and I refer to it as the withdrawal. And I think what we need to appreciate here is you need to get to grips with what this actually feels like. It is an unpleasant feeling. Okay, and I want to just go back a bit. If you imagine here, so the more you drink, the more your brain has to overstimulate to counter the depressing effects of the alcohol. Okay, so when you're then in this phase, if you've only had a small amount to drink, it will just be a mildly uncomfortable and slightly anxious feeling. If you've had a right old skinful the night before, you're going to be in complete bits the next day. That's when people are really anxious and they've got the shakes and all of that. Okay, so it is not a pleasant place. And the best way I can describe it is essentially it erodes our mental resilience. So your mental resilience totally disappears and you feel weak, you feel afraid, and everything feels too much trouble and too overwhelming. How I tend to think of it is, let me stop this screen share for a minute. So how I tend to think of it, and I've mentioned this a few times before, but think of problems on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being, the very easiest to get to grips with, like, I don't know, a difficult email to deal with, or you've got a bill to pay or something like that, going all the way up to 10, which is, I don't know, like death of a loved one, or, some kind of life-changing injury, or, you find out you're cancer and you've only got a few weeks left to live, whatever it might be. Most people, when they're in a fairly good position, and let me jump back to the screen share again. Most people, when they've got a good balance, so when they're here, right back at the beginning, when they've got a good chemical balance, they can deal with most things. They can deal with anything up to, I don't know, a 5, a 6, or even a 7 without too much of a problem. But when you're over here, with this complete chemical imbalance where you're overstimulated, you can't concentrate on anything, your brain's jumping around a bit, even the 1s or 2s look too much effort. And that's what I used to do this, and I found out a lot of people used to do this, is essentially do a week's work in 3 days, because I'd be drinking all weekend and I couldn't do anything at work apart from the most basic of tasks on Monday and even Tuesday. And then I'd power through all my work on Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. And that's essentially what it is. Now, sorry to keep jumping backwards and forwards, but when we've got that basic concept in place, what we need to bear in mind is, if you are a regular drinker, this overstimulation phase, it lasts for anything up to 48 hours. Even if you've only had 1 or 2 drinks, it will be there. It may be almost unnoticeable, but it will be there for anything up to 24 hours. So if you are drinking every day, this is essentially what you're doing. You're feeling nervous and unpleasant and overstimulated right through to say you have your first glass of wine or whatever you drink when you get home from work in the evening. You feel unpleasant, anxious all day long, and then when you get home, this happens. You take an alcoholic drink and it balances out the stimulant. So what the alcohol is actually doing for you when you're a daily drinker, it is a wonderful feeling. It's so nice to sit down at the end of the day and have that drink. But the benefit is it's just correcting the chemical imbalance. It's anesthetizing the overstimulation. So that wonderful feeling you get when you're drinking every day, that first drink of the day, is what we who never drink have all the time. And that's not to say you don't have bad days. Of course we do. But we always have the benefit of this mental resilience because these balances are always correct for us. So this is what happens. So the daily drinker feels good in the evening when they're having their drink, but that's only as good as they would have felt had they never had a drink in the first place. And then when the drink wears off, usually 3 or 4 in the morning, this happens. It's equivalent of having a ridiculous 8 or 9 cups of really strong black coffee. So they can't sleep. They wake up 3 or 4 in the morning. They lie there worrying. They get up in the morning exhausted, but also overstimulated and anxious, and drag themselves through the day until they get to the evening where they get their great reward, where they anaesthetize all this tiredness and overstimulation. Okay, so that's the basic concept. Now, when we're talking about people who turn around and they say, I need alcohol because I've got this problem or that problem or whatever problem, when you're in this phase, whatever your problem is, it looks 10 times worse than it really is. Okay. Now, what I need to emphasize here is I do not know what each and every one of you has gone through or is going through. I do not know your personal problems. I cannot relate to probably 90% of them. But what I do know, whatever problems you think you have, they look 10 times worse than they actually are when you're here, and they look as they ought to when you're here. So if you are saying to someone, I don't know, so to give my example, if you'd have asked me 7 years ago before I stopped drinking why I drank, I would have said, well, a few reasons, but one of them, for example, would be, I don't like my job, I don't like it. Okay, and I would have told you that it makes me unhappy and that alcohol is the only thing that allows me to cope with it. But actually, it wasn't that at all. What it was is this made an unpleasant job 10 times worse, and this put it into its real perspective, which was bearable. Okay, so what I would say is, when you're talking about underlying problems, whatever they may be, you have to stop drinking first, because when you're in the overstimulation phase, those problems look far worse than they actually are. Okay, so a lot of people find their perceived problems like work, marital problems, kids, money, whatever it might be, they are problems, they are genuine problems, but our perception of them is warped by alcohol, because how we see them, they're these big, terrible problems that we can't cope with unless we're drinking. When they become like we can deal with them and they're fine, we're happy with them at that point. And when you stop drinking, you realize that actually what alcohol was doing, it was making molehills into mountains and then decreasing them back to molehills again. And that's the perceived benefit with drinking. So that's what I'm saying. You have to stop drinking first to get to grips with these things. Now, I know there will be people there thinking, yes, but I've got this problem and it's much worse than you can possibly imagine. Let me move on to the next issue, which is people with the problems that are 9 or 10s, the really big problems. Okay, let me start by telling you somebody I met in an AA meeting, and she was really badly burnt. And when she told her story, what had happened to her, she was in a car with her husband and 2 young children, and the car had crashed, and she managed to get out, but her husband and 2 young children were trapped in there. And then, as unfortunately happens with vehicles, sometimes the fuel tank burst into flames. So she watched her husband and 2 young children burn to death, trying to get them out, and got horribly burnt in the process. Failed, they died, and she got horribly burnt. And that was what had happened to her. Now, I can't even begin to imagine what that must be like or how you would cope with it or whatever, and I don't pretend to. But what I do know is human beings are capable of dealing with things that you probably think you would never be able to cope with. And one of the ways we cope with them is that things that are there all the time, we slowly incorporate into our existence and they become a part of us. And to give an example, which I've given before, most people watching this will be wearing clothes. Now, if you concentrate, you can actually feel the clothes against you. But most of the time during the day, we're not conscious of the feel of having clothes against us. Now, when something is there all the time, it ceases to impact us on a conscious level. So when something really terrible happens, over time, it's not that you forget about it or it becomes less painful, but you become better able to cope with that pain. What alcohol does is, because it anesthetizes it, we never actually get to grips with it. So it elongates these problems. And again, I emphasize, I'm not saying that I've been through all of these terrible things and I can understand what it's like, but grieving as a process is about getting to grips with things and understanding them and accepting them. When you're anesthetizing them with alcohol, you're not actually doing that. You're not dealing with the problem in the same way that if you could take some kind of all over body anesthetic, so you never had any feeling, and used it for your whole life, so you would never feel clothes. And when you suddenly stopped using that anaesthetic, your clothes would feel really obvious and there. That's exactly what we do with alcohol when we're trying to get to grips with these problems. And what I would definitely say is you need to bear in mind that when you are here, no matter what your problem is, this dynamic remains. When you are drinking, you're bringing yourself back to a normal level. And when you are not drinking, it is worse. So no matter what the issue is, this phase when the alcohol wears off means you're far worse off than you would have been had you not been drinking. The final point I would like to say is about genuine mental health issues. So this is a separate issue, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because people with mental health issues tend to gravitate towards problem drinking. And the question is it the mental health issue that leads to the problem drinking, or is it the problem drinking that leads to the mental health issue? Now, the fact of the matter is, saying mental health issues is a ridiculous umbrella term that covers a myriad of different things. Drinking alcohol on a regular basis does cause mental health issues because of that stimulation over stimulation point, and it also robs us of good quality sleep. It's probably worth just mentioning the sleep situation because I've got time, so I will go through it. But when we sleep isn't just about falling unconscious for a few hours and waking up good to go. Sleep is about going through certain sleep cycles. And the main differentiating factor between the sleep cycles is how deeply unconscious we are. Okay, so there's a sleep cycle called deep sleep, which, as you'd expect, you're very deeply asleep, you're very deeply unconscious. But right at the other end of the scale, there's something called REM sleep. And when they attach sensors to people and monitor them through REM sleep, it's really strange because their brain lights up almost as if they're fully awake. So what you need to think of with sleep, it's not just a question of going unconscious, it's a question of falling asleep and then your brain taking you through different levels of consciousness. So it's goes very deeply unconscious and then right up almost into fully awake and then back down again. And you go through these sleep cycles several times. Now, the problem we have is, and again, just to go back to this silly diagram, but when you're drinking, the first part of the night, you're here, you're overly depressed, overly sedated. So your brain can't get you up into REM sleep. It's not capable of it. It can't get you into the higher level consciousness cycles of sleep. It's not able to do it. And then, of course, here, when this happens, you can't sleep at all. And this is why so many drinkers find they wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning and are completely unable to get back to sleep. And they lie there worrying and unhappy and anxious. They might be absolutely exhausted, but they can't sleep. This is the reason they're overstimulated because of the chemical after effects of the drinking. So that robs them of good quality sleep. Now, sleep isn't particularly well understood. But what is, I don't think you really need to know the detail of it to know that if you're constantly interrupting your sleep pattern, it has a huge impact on your mental health, your well-being, everything. And a lot of people with mental health issues on antidepressants, whatever, find that stopping drinking, they can then stop the antidepressants or whatever it is, because actually it's alcohol that's causing the issue in the first place. Okay, so I think it's absolutely inarguable that long-term heavy drinking does cause mental health issues. But to go to the other side of the thing, it's also the case that people with genuine mental health issues not caused by alcohol do gravitate towards heavy drinking. And I think the simple fact of the matter is alcohol is a sedative. It anesthetizes. And if your brain isn't a particularly nice place to be, alcohol will provide a temporary, albeit very flawed solution in the short term. And of course, the main thing it's got going for it is it's readily available. It's the most readily available drug we have. So if you do have a problem and you need to deal with it, then drinking is often the easiest, most accessible way of doing something about it. The problem is, though, mental health issues, again, in terms of human understanding of the brain, we really are in our infancy, and a lot of these mental health issues we don't know much about. The generally accepted method at the moment, certainly among mainstream medicine, is to deal with it by drugs, different types of drugs and medicine. But the problem is there's no way of actually testing to see if it's working other than speaking to the patient. So if you do have a mental health issue, it's a very, very close collaboration between the medical professional and the patient to try different drugs, different medications, talk about side effects, how it makes you feel, how you sleep, all of these different elements. Now, the problem is it's a very delicate process. And if you're constantly going through the sedating and then overstimulation side, you can't get to grips with it. So even if you do have a mental health issue, I think it's essential that you stop drinking. And in fact, it's upsetting for a lot of people because they have or believe they have mental health issues, and they go to the doctor and they say, I have a mental health issue, that's why I drink. And the doctor says, stop drinking and come back when you stop drinking. And they become very upset and agitated because their way of looking at it is, yeah, but I'm drinking to help with the mental health issue. But actually, frustrating as it is, that is the correct answer, because the medical professional can't provide any help and advice when the patient's swinging between either the over anxiousness and withdrawal, or the over sedation, so that the problem doesn't seem to be there at all. So I think that was pretty much it. I'm just going to go to the Facebook and see if there's any comments. Again, I having this old problem where I can't see the comments very easily. Just give me a minute and I'll see what I can do here. Here it is. Right, okay, so I'll see if I can have a look at these. No, I can only see 4 of them. I don't know how I managed it last time. I think I did work it out last time. I'll have a look on my phone quickly. Sorry, bear with me a minute. No, I can't see them at all, unfortunately. Never mind. I hope that was useful for everyone. Sorry, I can't see any of the other comments at the moment, so I'll try and sort that out for next time. I'm not really sure what's going on there. No, I can only see the first 4 of them, which is annoying. Okay, well, I hope that was useful, everyone. And I'll probably post for next week on Thursday again. And again, I don't mind whether I do topics or just field questions. But if you look out for the post on Thursday, and I will probably see you all next week. Thanks. Bye.